Day quarantine this is at this point.
I've lost count pretty quickly.
Quarantine's really a strong word in the sense that we're both in the same room right now. So
we're almost 6 feet apart.
Yeah, pretty
close enough.
Yeah, and the cigar smoke, of course, is known to kill the coronavirus.
Yeah, it's sterilizing the environment.
That's right. That's right. It smokes it out. So, well, we are here again with another Kings Highway Radio. The last two are, I'm afraid, are only going to be on Facebook. I've had some technical difficulties related to the audio from those. In fact, we just straight up had some technical difficulties on the last one.
Yeah, but it's all been in the name of modernization. We're trying to make the podcast a little more, legitimate, be on Facebook and other platforms and stuff. And
absolutely.
Yeah.
But we are going to start also posting these on YouTube in addition to everywhere else. So right now we're on pretty much any podcast catcher out there, even Spotify. We're also putting these on YouTube. We're going to stream them and leave them up there, and we're going to post videos, which is really just a still image and our voices, on YouTube. So we'll see how that goes, just trying to spread it around. So look up our YouTube channel, just called Kingsway Talk, like everything else. Mm-hmm. So take a look at that, subscribe, smash like on that bell and whatever else.
All the YouTube things.
Yes, all the things that they say. So let's just jump into it. How are you staying put together during this time? Of course, you've got a job that's particularly stressful during this.
Yeah, so I am I'm an educator. I'm a teacher at a private Christian school here in Denton called Denton Calvary Academy. And I also run kind of a small business on the side. I teach private music lessons to kids and adults. It's been unique because over spring break, I went camping with a friend of mine, and everything was normal when we left. And then it seemed like 2 days later we came back and everything happened. And it was, we got an email the Friday of spring break, which I guess would have been that second week of March, from our school board basically saying that, we were going to be taking a break. And at the time it was only for 2 weeks. And then obviously now with the new legislation in Texas, it's extended to the end of the semester. And man, it was something else because my wife and I both teach at the same school, and in a matter of 24 hours, we had to figure out how to transition all of our teaching from the classroom to online. And for me, I teach a few different classes at the school, but one of the classes that I teach is high school and middle school choir. And having to transition a choir class, which granted, you really just kind of have to fly by the seat of your pants. Our concert and our competitions and things like that got canceled. But, you kind of make things do. But what's been weird is being at home so much. And it almost feels like, at once it feels like an early summer because you're home every day. But on the other hand, it feels like being in prison because you have to stay home. You can't really go to any stores. You can't take any trips. You're still having to work and still having to put out content. And I think for me, I'm my personality type, I tend to be a busybody, and so it's hard for me to stay sane if I don't have a project. So it seems like every day I've got a new project. So, in the last month of being quarantined, we've got chickens. I've built shelves in our house. I've been working on my truck. Like I've had a long list of things that I've been trying to do, and it's helped. But at the same time, I need to remind myself that this is kind of a unique opportunity that the Lord is affording me to slow down, to read more, to dig into Scripture more, to pray more, to be more still, which those things are hard. But so on one hand, I'm restless, but on the other hand, I'm really thankful because I see this, though it's difficult, as an opportunity to really seek the Lord in a way that I don't always have the chance to do. So. Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, it's been kind of the same here. My wife and I have definitely had our struggles. We did a little project yesterday where we were both expressing that we just struggle having things to do to keep busy with each other. And I was like, okay, so here's what we can do. Let's go get a piece of paper and write down things we can do together at home. And we'll tear it up into little slips and put it in a bowl. And anytime we want to find something to do, we'll just pull something out.
That's a great idea.
Do whatever that is, like play board games or read together or watch a movie or something like that. Because you're just trying to think of unique ways to spend time together that will not be the same old thing over and over again.
Absolutely.
But I've been spending a lot of time, just like you said, reading Scripture and reading other books. I finished Joel Beake's Revelation commentary last night, and
awesome.
It is fantastic. Highly recommended, especially if you're somebody who is looking for Revelation commentaries that don't start going on about locusts being Black Hawk helicopters and trying to call some particular politician the Antichrist or something like that.
It's hard to find nowadays.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of good stuff out there about, this kind of thing. It's just that it's overshadowed by a lot of confusion. I mean, how much, especially in America. America has had a lot of dominance from the dispensational viewpoint on Revelation for at least the last couple of generations.
Yeah.
And it's not to say that there's nothing contributed there or that they're 100% unutterably wrong on every little thing, but simply like we were talking about watching the Bible Project videos, which is another fantastic YouTube channel. Mm-hmm. And they have a 2-part series on Revelation. And it's funny to look at the comments on those videos because their videos are just beautifully put together visually, and they kind of explain not just the structure of the book, but what it's trying to say, and the picture that it's giving you of Jesus and of the work that he is doing in our world. And it goes through everything, and there's no... It's very much... I don't know if they're all-millennial or post-millennial. I'm pretty sure they're not post-millennial. The way they describe it, I'd pretty much say they're in the all-millennial camp, but it's like... It's a right handling of the word. It's straightforward. It's supported by exegesis, and all these people come in there. Well, I believe that in reading Revelation literally. Like, no, you don't. You don't believe in reading it literally. You believe in reading it, or in taking symbolic imagery and making it non-symbolic,
into turning it into physical objects. Yeah,
right. So now that we've aggravated all of our dispensational listeners, but anyway, that's a fantastic book if you're looking for something. It's because it's not just a dry academic commentary. It is basically like a series of sermons written out.
Yeah, I love that.
It's the Lectio Continua series, which I'm not familiar with other books in it, but if they're anything like that, I'm going to go get them because they're good.
Yeah. Two of my favorite resources, in reading Revelation, one tends to be more pastoral and one tends to be more, just expressly theological. When I was in seminary, I read Reading Revelation Responsibly by Michael Gorman.
That's going to be my next book, I think.
Yeah, and what's interesting about Michael Gorman, I could be mistaken, but I believe he teaches at it's either a Catholic seminary or a Methodist seminary, but I don't know that he's Catholic or Methodist. But so he kind of finds his place in more of a liturgical tradition. But I love it because he talks about how Revelation, the book of Revelation, is almost written as a liturgy unto itself, and this it's a liturgy that expresses itself as protest to, evil hegemonist power in whatever time and place that it finds itself. And I love that because it makes the book of Revelation so much more dynamic and so much more timeless, and it also makes it a book that speaks to the particular situations that we're going through whenever we find ourselves, whether we're looking at, power that's totalitarian, or whether we're looking at power that's fascist, or whether we're looking at just the power in our own lives that's trying to sort of dictate the way we live against the kingdom or contra the kingdom of Christ. Another book that I found really helpful, which I've only read a bit of, but I've had it recommended to me by a lot of pastor friends, is Eugene Peterson's commentary, Reversed Thunder. And again, it's just a really great pastoral resource for how to not only read the book of Revelation, but how to sort of integrate it and communicate it to a congregation. And I think that's always the biggest challenge, is pastors tend to shy away from that book because they don't know how to preach it.
Yeah. Well, and that's the thing. Like, I've just noticed a lot of, especially the more reformed churches or churches that try to take air exegesis a little more seriously, will just avoid it a lot because you see so much challenge from people. For one thing, you often have a lot of people in your congregation who have major, deep-seated preconceived notions about it. And so if you start pushing on those, you can wind up with a lot of agitated congregants.
Sure.
You didn't talk about the Antichrist doing this, one, the other thing. It's like, it's not the revelation of the Antichrist. It's the revelation of Jesus Christ.
The Christ, yeah.
So if you are wrestling with that, definitely look that book up. And I think right now, kind of transitioning to the other thing we wanted to talk about, right now, it was more than ever is a good time for churches to consider going through that, because what you really see in that book is an image of the slain lamb as the triumphant king leading his army that is willing to die for the sake of the glory of the slain lamb.
That's right.
And to bring the reality of the gospel to bear on the hearts and minds of the world.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of stuff in there, and we're not going to be able to cover that because that's not even really what we set out to talk about here. But read that book. Read Kim Riddlebarger's Amillennial book. That's a fantastic book too. But definitely Joel Beeke's Commentary on Revelation.
Yeah.
So the other thing we wanted to talk about before we get into our interview.
Yes, which we are excited about. We'll talk to you more about that in a sec.
We wanted to talk about, like, what is it that churches are doing during this time? How are we dying to ourselves for the sake of the people around us right now?
Yeah, and it's a unique time. As our listeners will know, what we've been going through is this book, Power Religion, and talking about different sort of iterations of power within the church, whether it's in politics and psychology and preaching and the church growth movement, whatever it is. But, what we wanted to do today was just take a brief moment to kind of discuss, like, what is the state of the church in the midst of a global pandemic? Obviously with technology, church is in a very different place, and we find some churches across the country, stubbornly refusing to follow the guidelines and still trying to meet, and what we would argue being irresponsible with their stewardship of the body of Christ. And then you've got other churches who tend to sort of propagate a culture of fear. And so, we just wanted to have kind of a candid discussion about that. In my estimation, I'm 30 years old, so I'm right square in the middle of the millennial generation, the generation that didn't necessarily grow up with technology, but kind of got technology at sort of a pivotal age, in high school. I mean, I think the iPhone came out the year I graduated high school. And so, we've got this unique opportunity as the church where we're given technology as a resource to sort of steward the ins and outs of what the church does, from preaching to community to the sacraments. But very often, I was listening to an interview. The Holy Post is one of our favorite podcasts, and they were doing a talk discussing, the state of technology in the midst of a pandemic, and they were saying that a lot of times what has happened, Sky Jitani was discussing, and he said one of the things that happens is that, there's a lot of good that's come out of the church because the church has found new creative ways to serve its community while still remaining socially distant. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, there might be some sort of hidden ills that are plaguing the church in the midst of this time if we become too dependent on technology. And one of the things they used as an example was treating the church as a sort of content machine. So looking at the church as merely a producer of content, whether it be sermons, whether it be recorded worship, whether it be podcasts. And kind of the trouble with that is, as a consumeristic society in sort of a postmodern era, we already gravitate toward seeing content as king. Like watching sermons at home in our pajamas or listening to our favorite worship band and sort of using the content that we take in as a filter through which we see the legitimacy of the church. So if your pastor doesn't preach as good as Matt Chandler or Andy Stanley, or if your worship band isn't as good as Hillsong or Elevation or whatever, what tends to happen is you tend to think, well, I'm going to stomach my local church and then go home and watch this other stuff that's really going to feed me. Mm-hmm. And what we're seeing, I think, I don't want to just talk about the negative circumstances or the negative consequences rather, but I think a lot of times what's happening on the negative side of things is that we are beginning to reduce the local church to merely a content machine, and therefore seeing the legitimacy of our church with how well it produces content to feed us while we sit at home on Sunday morning. And my question would just be, how do we continue to function as the physical, local, embodied community of saints, meeting each other's needs, partaking in the sacraments, sitting under the, not just like preached word through the video platform, but the preached word through the physical mouth of the preacher? How are we still living within that environment in the midst of a pandemic when everything is happening on a screen? And then to take it further, what about churches who don't have those resources, or people who don't have the bandwidth or the budget or the ability to produce high quality content? Are they now seen as less valuable?
Right, exactly.
So, I mean, I know those are just sort of questions I'm throwing out there, but those are things I'm wrestling with as I'm thinking about the responsibility of the church and how we as the church universal continue to grow in holiness in the midst of all of this.
Well, and that's really the big challenge I think we're all facing is how is it that we can minister as the church and each church minister as a church in a time when you can't be together? Because, I mean, our sacraments, our ordinances, whatever kind of term you want to apply to them, they're things that require a physical presence. And in fact, it's kind of like what we're seeing is God is preventing us from having those times. And, I do not agree with the concept of remote Lord's Supper or something like that. I mean, obviously, you don't have to gather the whole church necessarily to baptize somebody, but like I've seen people who, I can't remember who it was, some church had posted up pictures of like somebody's got a plate with some bread and some orange juice, and somebody else has got like a plate of cookies and some soda. It's like, you can take communion with us however you want.
Goldfish and chocolate milk.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, no.
Well, and actually, I read a really interesting post on Twitter where they were, maybe it was a repost of an article, I don't remember, but one of the things they were saying I thought was fascinating, I'd never considered this, was there is a value in missing communion. And not missing in the sense that we don't have it, but missing in the sense of longing
for it,
like longing for communion. And I thought that was so fascinating because I think unfortunately, this is not an indictment, so please don't take it that way. But I think unfortunately in churches that have a low theology of the sacraments or ordinances, they tend to see communion as strictly remembrance. Therefore, the elements don't really matter. Even the institution itself doesn't really matter, because it's really just a medium for us to remember Jesus. But, Dave and I tend to follow more of the lead of John Calvin, who says that, we're not transubstantiationists. We're not even Luther with his idea of, I believe it was the consubstantiation of the illocal presence or whatever.
Now the Lutherans are mad at us too.
So we're just making everyone mad today. But we tend to follow the lead of Calvin, where he says that there is something that really happens in the act of communion, in the act of the Lord's Supper. I mean, like,
there is a true spiritual presence there.
Absolutely. But it's a mystery. However, Jesus gave us a very clear way to practice this. And as you read the New Testament, you read about Paul and the apostles talking about how they long to be in communion with their people. They long to experience that with their people. And granted, they couldn't have anticipated the technological landscape that we live in now. Yet, I think there's something valuable to that longing, that desire to experience communion with a physical group of people, because communion is not just between me and God. It's also between me and my brothers and sisters. Like, what we're doing is we're saying we are all on the same playing field. We are all in need of Christ. We all need this bread and this wine or this juice as a representation of the body and blood of Christ, because it equalizes us. It humanizes us. And if we only have that as merely an experience between me and God, and it's just about me remembering what Jesus did, like, I don't need bread and wine to remember what Jesus did. But if it's more than that, then those things are important. And I think that just speaks to one aspect of what is in many ways lost in the practice of the church in the midst of a pandemic. And I think maybe rather than trying to create paltry substitutes for that, the best thing we can do is encourage people to enter into a season of lament, desiring to have that, yearning for that. And then when we do have that again, it makes the institution that much more valuable.
Yeah, I mean, it should be a time of longing for that, because I can tell you, from a very personal level, I definitely long for that. And I know that's something in my church, and most likely in your church as well, that's just something that really weighs in our hearts, is our inability in this time to have that connection and that celebration and remembrance is a part of it. I mean, Jesus
Absolutely.
said, "Do this in remembrance of me," but it doesn't stop with that, and because it is a partaking of a physical act that represents our daily partaking of the work of Christ in our lives.
Absolutely.
And I think that we should pray fervently that God will reinstitute that time, that he will bring an end to this time of separation and let us be together again.
Absolutely. And I think for me, one of the weirdest things has been, I'm kind of an interim worship leader at my church right now. One of the strangest things has been kind of pre-recording worship, because though the worship might look better that way, though it might feel better that way, and it's a little more polished and more video friendly, so to speak. Mm-hmm. One of the hardest things is, you're sitting in a room by yourself talking to people who aren't there. It feels like, anyway. Yeah. And you really,
like right now.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, exactly. In many ways we're talking to each other, but it's like, with worship, we're recording worship on Tuesday nights that's being published on Sunday mornings. And I feel like I really feel a sense of sadness that there's not that interaction. You're not able to see the saints worshiping. You're not able to worship with the saints. And granted, we're not sitting here saying that churches shouldn't do live streams and shouldn't do video stuff, but I think that, J. Todd Billings is someone that I really appreciate as a theologian. And one of the things that he says is, this quarantine offers us an opportunity. And that opportunity is not to try and glaze over the sadness and the tragedy of this time with our technology, but rather to enter into it and use technology as much as you need to. But don't be afraid to put both feet in the water of lament and say, man, we're all in this together, and this is sad, and we are yearning for the healing that only Christ can bring. And I think just like the people of Israel going through exile or going through seasons of want that they did, it caused them to, yearn for God in a new way. And just like, on the other hand, Israel often created makeshift gods for themselves, may we not be the kinds of churches that use even good things like technology and live streams and different outlets to substitute the real experience of being the local church with one another.
And I guess one more thing to kind of address, probably not just a little more briefly, but it's weighing on both of our hearts. This has been a hard time for a lot of folks who are like me and you, who we both have generally considered ourselves to be conservative guys, from a political sense. But what we see a lot of conservatives doing on the internet right now has been, I hesitate to call it crazy, but it's not making any kind of political conservatism look good. Because what you have is a very aggressive, very angry, negative viewpoint that does not honor Christ coming out of the mouths of people who ought to have as their first thought, is what's coming out of my mouth going to honor Christ? And I see a lot of people very worried about political consequences. And you know what? I'm not saying that political consequences do not matter. They do.
Sure.
But the fact of the matter is that when you are using a line of thought to go after some issue related to the coronavirus that is illogical, inconsistent, and not truth-honoring, because it's like beginning with the conclusion of the government and media are bad, everything they do is bad, all they want to do is take away our freedom, and then you move from there to try to circle back around to that conclusion with some kind of conspiracy theory is not even the right word, because they're not necessarily accusing people of there being a literal conspiracy. It's more an assumption of malevolence on everyone's part. And of course, certain, a lot of political figures are ginning that up too. But Christians, we shouldn't be doing that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, what tends to happen during times like this, during any time of crises, is, it's tempting to think that it reveals the worst in people. And then on the other hand, you have some people who would say, no, it reveals the best in people. And I think, what we discussed before is that no, it just reveals what's inside of people. And I think God uses tragedy as a means of surgery in us to sort of expose what's inside of us and to say, okay, you're either going to let me deal with this and cut this out and clean this, or you're going to let this continue to fester and disease inside of you.
Well, and we talked about that pretty broadly, but I'm sure we'll end up addressing more specific issues from that later. So we're going to take a little break now, and I'm going to try again to play your song since Facebook saw fit to mute it on our last live stream. So you probably will happen again on Facebook.
Well, that's all right. We'll see how it goes.
But we're going to have it in the podcast since no one's messing with my podcast so far.
There you go.
And we'll see how it lasts on YouTube as well. See if it gets me any kind of issues with the robots that run around and look for potential problems. So anyway, we're going to take a little break. But after that break, after we listen to that, we are going to play an interview we did earlier this week with Kyle Strobel. And how is it that you got connected up with him?
Yeah, so we've been super excited for this interview for a while. As you guys know, if you've been listening, we've been discussing the book Power Religion by several different authors, J.I. Packer, Alistair McGrath, Chuck Colson, Ed Welch, etc. And this book goes through a sort of spectrum of different issues, particularly regarding power in the church and toxic power and those sort of things. Well, I read a book a couple of years ago, kind of going through a hard time leaving a church, that talked about toxic power in the church. And the book was titled The Way of the Dragon and the Way of the Lamb. And I'd seen this book sort of advertised, and I'd seen different people recommend this book to me. And it was a book by Kyle Strobel and Jamin Goggin. And Kyle Strobel's the son of Lee Strobel, and Jamin Goggin was and I think still is a pastor. And this book was, man, I read it, and turned around and read it again because it was so impactful. It just talks about the influence of toxic power in the church, and what they do is they set out to sort of confront what does it mean for us to be powerful in our weakness, the way the Bible describes it, and how is the church really sort of pursued a vision of power that is not that at all, but rather a vision of power that is sort of taking control and trying to pursue importance and those sort of things. And the way they did this book was so amazing. They interviewed what they called sages in the faith, like these older men and women who had lived a life of being powerfully weak. Anyway, we thought it would be really great to get Kyle on in an interview and just kind of ask him questions about his book and ask him questions just about power in the church in general, because it related to what we've been talking about. And I got connected with Kyle because when I was in seminary, my church history professor, Steve Bagby, he and Kyle were friends in college, and Steve recommended that Kyle would be, at the time I was interested in pursuing sort of some PhD work and related to Jonathan Edwards and his, kind of untapped theology of angels and that sort of thing. And I reached out to Kyle for some recommendations and resources and kind of got his email and contact through that. And then we just thought, let's just give it a try. Let's reach out to him and see if he'd be interested in doing this. And by God's grace, he responded and was more than happy to do an interview with us. So, we got to sit down with Kyle for about an hour and ask him some really great questions about his book. And he just gives us so much great wisdom related to this topic. So,
well, we're going to take a quick break here. And when we come back, we will be with Kyle Strobel. So I'll just go ahead and say, as always, to please consider joining our Patreon. It's patreon.com/KingswayTalk. You can find more info and archived stuff at kingswaytalk.com, going all the way back to the very first Spurgeon audio stuff from like 5 years ago. But please, as always, brothers and sisters, stay on that straight and narrow. all this, and it's like, we didn't get a recording of that. Okay, good. Yeah, there we go. Well, we really appreciate you joining us for this here.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, it's it's funny because we've only corresponded kind of online, but I'm really thankful to Steve Bagby, our mutual friend, because he's kind of the contact for you, and so it means a lot that you would take the time to do this with us. I told Steve that we would be doing this, and I tried to entice him to get on the call, but he's got kids or something. He's busy. I don't know.
I think it's just laziness.
Yeah, I think so too. There's no excuse when we're all stuck at home, right?
That's right. That's right. What else is doing?
Yeah.
Well, I'm happy to be with it. I'm glad to do it with you guys.
Yeah. I figured what we could do is maybe introduce ourselves a little bit and tell you about the podcast, and then maybe hear, just for the listeners' sake. I think we both know a little bit about you and what you do, but maybe you could tell us a little bit about your role as a professor and the different things that you do, and then maybe we can jump into the questions if that works.
Sure. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I'll let Dave kind of tell you a little bit about himself, and then we'll talk a bit about the podcast as well.
Oh, sure. Me and Jarod met at the Christ Community Church in Denton. That's where I live now. That's where I still go to church. And I had started this podcast about 5 years ago. It was called Spurgeon Audio back then, because I was just recording Spurgeon sermons, which I still do that, but we've kind of expanded into other interests. And so now we've kind of created the second podcast, which we call King's Highway Radio. And we just get together to talk about stuff. And we've been talking about kind of the general topic of, how do you want to describe this? I mean, it's such a broad.
Yeah, we touch on a lot of different issues that, kind of face the church, and, some contemporary, some, that have been happening for a while, and kind of our take on it. But lately it's been a particular focus on kind of power in the church, and a little bit about me. So I graduated Redeemer Seminary, which was Westminster, Texas. Back in the end of 2016. I was the last graduating class before it transitioned.
Wow. Is that how you know Bagby then?
Yeah, he was the dean there, and he was also my church history professor. And so he's at SMU now, just across the street from where we were. But it was interesting because at the time I was finishing seminary and was really interested in church planting and kind of jumping into that whole world. And then the Lord really brought my wife and I through a pretty serious wilderness experience, I guess is how I would describe it, where, all of my kind of idols of church planting and ministry were sort of stripped away. And, we went through a sabbatical and then stepped away from vocational ministry for like a year. And during that summer, that was the summer of 2017, maybe it was 2018, I can't remember, but I came across you in Jamin's book and read it straight through, and turned around and read it again because it was so impactful for me. It spoke a lot to what I was going through, what the Lord was kind of showing me, and I think since that time on the podcast, Dave and I have been talking a lot about these topics of power in the church, from our unique experience, but also from what we had seen in friends of ours and other traditions and things. We're both part of Acts 29 churches and have really, seen the fall of a lot of people in Acts 29 associated with Acts 29 things. And
sure.
So it's been heavy on our hearts. And so lately, what we've been discussing in the podcast is this book that Dave kind of uncovered. I don't know if you want to tell them a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I was doing what any other person would be doing, which is sitting around in a cigar bar reading B.A. Carson's book on exegetical fallacies. And
sure.
I found a mention in there of another book that he had participated in, which is called Power Religion. And he had written an essay. It's a collection of a bunch of essays. It's published all the way back in 1992, which by modern standards is pretty much the Stone Age. But I was really intrigued by what he said about it because the book is a discussion of all different elements of the issue of power in the church, and everything from political power and the kind of Christian fundamentalist obsession with them being the moral majority and that kind of thing, to charismatic stuff, to psychology, even in all kinds of different ways that power works itself out. But one of the sections is about what they call power preaching, but it's a lot of the issues that you guys discussed in your book. And so when I was talking about this with Jarod, and he mentioned, oh, it would be great to talk about this with you. And so we really wanted to do that. And also we wanted to be able to say we finally you're the second person I've had on this podcast who's written a book, but you're the first one who has had someone portray him in a movie. And so
That's true. That's a very narrow window you're working with there.
Yeah, so yeah, we were just hoping to kind of venture into some of that, and a lot of it will be broadly, the questions kind of just broadly power in the church and how to confront that with humility and courage, and some of your advice and from your experience. But it'd be great if you wouldn't mind just giving us a little snippet about what you do on the daily, as opposed to just being in quarantine right now, but kind of what your job is, that sort of stuff.
Yeah, well, I have kind of an unusual position. So I'm at Talbot School of Theology at Biola, and basically my job is kind of split into three different spheres in a sense. So I work at the Institute of Spiritual Formation, which is it houses three different master's degrees we have in spiritual formation. What we used to call back in the Puritan era things like Christian ethics or experiential divinity or something like that. And so I do I teach everything from hermeneutics to history and traditions of Christian spirituality. In that we do some stuff on virtue ethics and formation stuff, looking at kind of medieval through kind of Protestant accounts of those things. And but then I also teach this we have a program that's actually based in the Institute, but it's for everyone else. So every seminary student at Talbot is required to do a year and a half of spiritual theology. And that is that theology that we used to do under the guise of Christian ethics. And so this would be a book like The Religious Affections by Edwards, for instance, would be a good example of this, where we're giving an account of what is the nature of the Christian life, what is the nature of Christian formation, what does it mean to walk in the Spirit? So it's really addressing those kind of questions all the way down to kind of theological anthropology questions. And then I helped also, so my third sphere is I helped start a program that just started this year at Talbot, which is MA Classical Theology program. So we have a new master's in classical theology that we developed in basically in kind of partnership with our Great Books program, the Torrey Honors Institute. Someone like Fred Sanders, who's there, is a part of this, and so it's a theology degree through the classical tradition and through the great books of the Christian tradition, and so it's interesting because my background academically is I'm a systematic theologian by training and an Edwards scholar at that, but I actually spend most of my time not in kind of straight systematics classes, but much more into the kind of more practical side of things in terms of the spiritual formation stuff, but then keeping my foot in the door in the classical theology as well. I teach in that. So it's fun, but I'm pulled in very many different directions.
Wow. I can imagine that'd be challenging, almost like splitting your brain daily.
Yeah, I do feel like I've got a foot in several different worlds simultaneously. So but it keeps things interesting. I feel like I have the opposite problem that a lot of seminary professors have that end up teaching the same class over and over and over again. Whereas I'm teaching different classes and a very wide range of courses. And so it's certainly, boredom is not a problem I'm struggling with.
Wow. That's excellent, man. It's interesting because, Dave and I are also very different in our, I guess I would say, our very minimal theological equipping that we both have. But, Dave is, he's the guy I've always said is my systematic theology friend.
just knows everything forward and backward I could ever think of about systematic theology. And then when I was in seminary, my training was in biblical theology. So it's interesting to see how those two worlds intersect and how they work themselves out on on a daily basis, whether it's what you're reading or what you're discussing or just what you're thinking about.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that, man. I really appreciate you sharing that. I guess it would be a good place for us to maybe jump into some of the questions. We've got a few questions that we charted out. We may or may not get to all of it, but so the first question I wanted to ask, just sort of generally speaking, is what inspired you or motivated you to tackle this topic of what you call toxic power in the church?
Yeah. Well, Jamin and I, and Jamin's my closest friend in all the world, and we write together, and he's a pastor now, and so we've been kind of on the same trajectory for a lot of years, back when we started seminary, actually. And for us, this book actually came out of a 2-book kind of thing that we were working on. We wrote a book called Beloved Dust, and that was really the first book. And in many ways, The Way of the Dragon, The Way of the Lamb is the sequel. Mm. And Beloved Dust, the focus of that is, what does it mean to kind of embrace the truth that you're a creature? Like how do we, and that's like the we are dust, right? That our belovedness comes from without. It comes from how God attends to us and sees us, not because of some intrinsic kind of goodness that we have. And so we did a kind of a long exploration in terms of what does it mean to just embrace the truth of who we are. Mm. And it became clear to us in that project that was leading us to wrestle through an idea about power and weakness. Yeah. And yet we didn't think we were capable of writing it. Wow. We kind of knew we were supposed to, but we kind of looked at each other and was like, who in the world are we to write a book about power? I mean, this book took about 7 or 8 years, like from beginning to end. We actually began it first in one sense, because one of the ideas that we had early that ended up becoming the core feature of the book was visiting these sages that we visited. And so we kind of realized that we didn't want to wait on that in case, they were sages, in part because they were elderly. And so, actually it was when John Stott died, he was on our list to talk to. And Jamin I remember he called me and said, who else is going to die before we think, man, I wish we would have gotten on a plane. And so that's what started it. And, along the way for us, we knew we could write a book. I mean, we have the training and skills to sit down and write a book and do all the proper exegetical work, historical work. We could do that. Yeah. But we realized that this topic, it needed more nuance and it needed more kind of enfleshment in reality than just a couple of young 30-year-olds kind of articulating what they think Scripture says about this. Like we actually wanted to see, what does this look like in action? And does it, because there's a sense where, I think, and this is, one of the things that's happened since the book's come out that's troubled me is that people by and large have universally agreed with us. Mm-hmm. And it's troubled me because clearly they don't agree with us.
Yeah, it's like there's this assent to what you're saying, but following through with it is so rare.
That's right, and I think it's there's a reality where I think folks are reading it and saying, okay, that has to be true based on just the biblical work, and they usually kind of value the people we're interviewing or whatever. But then when it comes to like actually living it out, there's a sense where they deeply believe. Now, I don't think anyone ever says this out loud, but they deeply believe this won't work. Like this just doesn't work. And so part of what we wanted to do is show people, look, weakness is, the Bible does not call us to weakness. It calls us to power. But it calls us to power in and through our weakness. And it's not going to be the kind of power you see in the world. There's going to be a different sort of power. And so part of what we wanted to do with those interviews in particular is to help show people, look, this actually does kind of work. It really is power. But also to kind of use those folks as a prophetic call against the fact that the church has given herself so wholeheartedly to worldly power.
Mm-hmm.
And so that, at the very beginning, we just felt called to kind of be the bad guys in the book. Like we wanted, it became clear to us early on, this is a journey we need to take people on because it's our journey, and we need to be very honest about our own temptations in it. Like I think maybe more than most issues in the church today, and I do think this is the most important issue that no one's talking about in the church today, because I think it touches every other issue, is that we need to create spaces for repentance. Because right now, I just don't know, particularly the people that have quote unquote power, people in leadership positions, people, whether that's in the church or parachurch, or, they just don't have places to be honest about their temptations, and in particular about that temptations to power. And so I think there needs to be we actually just held a conference several weeks back where we did that, and it was actually unbelievable to see. I mean, we at one point I looked across the kind of, it was at Jamin's church. I looked across the kind of auditorium, and I just saw we had these round tables with pastors, and you look across the room and you see pastors laying hands on each other, praying over one another, and people confessing the ways that they have been not only tempted by, but the way they've just given in to worldly power. And and even if that's just as a way to judge your ministry, positively or negatively, it's become clear to us that for a lot of people, they've bought into a vision of power that isn't good. I mean, for some people, like the people who are quote unquote successful, worldly power seems good to them, right? It's a good mirror because they look around, they see the numbers, they see the money, they see the influence, But the vast majority of pastors have bought into the same view of power, and it's a bad mirror. It's failure, right? And so there's something that can be profoundly freeing about realizing that's not power at all in the kingdom of God. And so when it became clear to us, we really wanted to try to articulate a vision of power that helped people see, one, that this saturates everything that we do, and two, by and large, there's no place that we could see, 8 years ago now, actually more than that now, almost 10 years ago now, there was no place we could see people actually having a discussion about it.
Gosh.
Yeah, one of the other subjects that we've been talking about probably somewhat frequently on this podcast is a lot of the stuff that's gone on in the charismatic movement and some of the craziness that comes out of there. And you see a lot of people in that movement who like to attach the word apostle to themselves. And you look at the way they like to behave, and then you look to how Jesus showed his apostles what it meant to follow after him. And what it looked like was putting yourself in the position of the lowest servant and then being willing to die. And it's just such a stark contrast to what, not just in the charismatic movement, but like all over the world, expressions in Christianity, whatever you see, different denominations, you just see so many people who, I mean, even we ourselves struggle with that. Everybody struggles with that because it's the normal human thought of power is power. It's being in charge. It's ruling with the iron fist and getting your way, getting your money.
Well, and I even wonder, kind of speaking to what you said, that, a lot of people were agreeing with it, but it is difficult and rare to find people really, pursuing power in weakness. We recently discussed the chapter in the Power Religion book about the church growth movement. And one of the things, Tom Nettles had an essay in there, and one of the things he said is that first and foremost, a lot of times the church growth movement is preoccupied with pragmatism and what makes the most sense to do, what seems to produce the most results. And I wonder if part of the hesitance of embracing power in weakness is that it's not very pragmatic. You know?
Yeah, well, and I think that's exactly right. Yeah, I mean, there's a sense where this issue gets down to, this is why I think it's so fundamental, because if your starting point is kingdom power, what's clear is, yeah, you can't ask merely pragmatic questions. And, one of the places where I think this shows up so much, and you're right, certainly, Dave, when you see every denomination, I think, probably has a kind of sacred cow of power. And it has, certain names or certain kind of words attached to it, like the word anointed has been ruined for me in this regard. Right? Because how many sins are done under the word anointed? I mean, it's just astonishing.
Yeah.
Or, in churches, the kind of quote unquote Bible churches, or even some of the more kind of confessional churches, certain preachers, if you're a good preacher, like that covers a multitude of sins.
Oh yeah.
And yet, there's a sense where I think if you're at a church that has ever hired someone, that is like the clearest depiction. You want a mirror to your church of how you view power. Look at the kinds of things that come up in hiring someone. And I'm not sure I've ever seen a church who just taking straight kind of biblical characteristics of wisdom and actually looked for them.
Wow. Yeah.
And if you look at like the hiring processes, what do they actually give folks? They give folks pragmatic kind of usually skills, like it's astonishing how many of my grads out of seminary will go and apply for a job at a church and never once be asked if they pray.
Wow.
But they're always asked for like a video of their sermon.
Yeah.
Right?
Or a record of the success in their previous ministries or something.
Totally. Yeah. And it's interesting when you look at those processes, how, like, what are we actually looking for? And we shouldn't be surprised that what we're seeing in the church is evil power when we've never bothered even looking for wisdom.
Wow.
And one of the things Jim and I have been talking about just now, I mean, just last night we were on the phone talking about this, as we can this has become probably a lifelong project for us. So we continue to kind of work on things in this area. And, one of the questions is that one of the things that kind of struck us as so odd when we started working on this book is, people came out of the woodwork when we started working on this book. The stories we would hear when people found out we were writing a book on power. It was astonishing. Like, they weren't even believable. Like, we knew that they were true because we knew these people, and they're still unbelievable. Like, the kind of horrific stories of evil power to work in the church. I mean, it's just crazy. And yet, what's interesting is that we would talk to people who go to churches with these leaders, and people would literally say things to us like, well, I know they're super arrogant, but man, they can preach. And it's like,
I'm
no,
sure they can.
It's like, that's just nuts. And one of the things that struck us recently as we've talked about this is, what if you took like 1 Corinthians 13 or the fruit of the Spirit and just asked that of our leaders?
Mm.
Would we say that they're patient? Would we say they're kind, that they endure all things? I mean, you look at most of the leaders, like, since, our book came out a little over 3 years ago now, and there's probably about a dozen major leaders who have fallen since then.
Yeah.
Not one of them would you have called kind.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
That understatement of the year.
And it's like that, but yet they were treated as anointed. Mm. And what we usually mean by that is they could get things done.
Yeah.
That's that business mentality being applied.
It's a business mentality. It sees accomplishment in a certain, well, one, it judges what that means, right? What the word accomplishment means or success means, right? It's using a kind of rubric that's worldly. And then it's allowing us to kind of focus on one or two things like accomplishment or success, and using that to look the other way when there's all these other very obvious signs that this person isn't giving themselves to the way of Jesus.
So true. I feel like that's a kind of a good transition into another question I wanted to ask, and I might be wrong. I don't have the book in front of me, but I believe it was your interview with Eugene Peterson. Which, speaking of timely interviews, gosh, that was a great one.
Yeah.
I believe it was with him, but it was when you asked him. You know, I'm paraphrasing here, but essentially, what did he feel was one of the more dangerous signs of power in the modern church? And his answer was pretty short. It was personality. And
Yeah.
I just wonder if you could maybe speak a little bit to that. What sense in which personality becomes kind of a covering up of toxic power in the church?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is where, one of the things that became clear to us in our study of Scripture, but also as we've looked into kind of how this fleshes itself out in ministry, is that, in the church more than probably anywhere else, we really allow the ends to justify the means. And some people don't get how tempting that is, I think. But because I used to, I would judge these folks pretty harshly earlier on in my career. Now I kind of know how they get there. Like when the whole thing happened with someone like Mark Driscoll, like I get exactly how that the whole thing happened with his book. Because it's like, how do you because this is an interesting question, right? Of how does a pastor get to the point where they're literally cheating, unethically, even on secular terms, cheating the New York Times bestseller list? I know exactly how he got there. I can tell you inch by inch how you get there. Well, wow, this is a really good book. Yeah, I think it could really help people. Well, think about all that we could do if we got this into people's hands. Yeah, I really think it could help. Well, there's some options here. You can imagine inch by inch, just kind of moving towards justifying a good end you have in mind. And I think that's what people don't fully understand of how tempting that is in ministry. How tempting it can be to start with a good, if we just assume it's a good, like, if wow, I think there's something going on here. I think people could really benefit from this. If you just start there, slowly you can begin to kind of justify. And, I think it becomes so easy. And I think Eugene, makes this point well about, for most folks that go into ministry, they go in naively, right? And this is true of almost every seminary student, right? You graduate, you've learned all these things, you've taken homiletics, you know how to preach a sermon, and you have this fantasy that I'm going to go into a church, I'm going to like all these people, I'm going to preach, they're going to just fall all over themselves, and they're going to be transformed. That's right, and everything's going to kind of go well. And you go there, you realize you don't actually like these people very much. You don't relate to them. You're preaching, but people aren't changing. You don't realize it yet, but you get this sinking feeling because you don't really kind of know fully well yet that you're actually valuing yourself based on what happens in the church. The church is kind of be a mirror to your goodness. Yeah. And so you're really struggling if things aren't going well, and you begin to realize kind of subconsciously that if you wield yourself, you can actually get things done. That if you're good enough, some people do this and there's not good enough, it doesn't go anywhere. Yeah. But if you're kind of good enough, right? If you're savvy enough, you can wield your flesh and grow a church. And the problem is the naivete out there is people think that somehow that's impossible. That somehow if a church is growing, it has to be because God's blessing it. Yeah. And it just is naive, right? I mean, it's, Corinth had this problem. This is not like a new problem, Oh, yeah. And Paul, to the Corinthians, he says that there's a way to preach that undermines the power of the cross. And he's using these super apostles as this kind of, as the kind of counter to him, right? He's going a different way. They have this different sort of ministry. And, there's fewer ways that are easier and that will be praised more readily than wielding your personality to try to grow a church around yourself. And in part, it's because that's what people are looking for.
Yeah.
People want toxic leaders, it turns out. People want someone whose coattails they can ride into the kingdom of heaven. And so if you give them that, people will respond to it. And the danger is that you will naively think that that's good because it's in the church, and it wouldn't be going well, quote unquote, if God didn't bless it. And I think that's what we saw over and over and over again. That's why people would say things like, yeah, they're arrogant, but they're such good preachers, is they assume that because things were exciting and growing, that it must be good.
Yeah, and I think it reveals, I remember in your book, you guys said that power is it's not a big church issue, or it's not even a pastoral issue in particular, right, but it's something that's common to all of us. And I think, like you said, we find out that people actually want toxic leaders. I think it shows that there's this underlying temptation toward toxic power in all of us.
That's right. Yeah, no, and it really does affect everything you do, and that includes how you value leadership, how you judge a church or a sermon or music in a service, right? Like all of it is predicated on a view of power you already have.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so good. There's a new book that came out somewhat recently. I've been working through and hoping that maybe we would discuss this book in the future on the podcast. But it's Chuck DeGroat's newest book, When Narcissism Comes to Church.
Sure.
And man, I'm reading through that and discussing it with my wife, and in several moments, we're just stopping and talking about a sentence for 30, 45 minutes, but there's one thing he says there, and I'd love to know your thought on it, just kind of digging deeper into maybe the interpersonal struggle with power that we all face. But he says that narcissism is essentially unreconciled shame that we are trying to cover up with a, quote, false self.
Yeah.
And I wonder, speaking to this sort of power-driven leadership, what role do you think this covering up or this false self plays in that pursuit of power?
Yeah, well, I think, what Chuck's getting to there, and I think he's exactly right about that. And part of the problem with, and this is where it affects pastors in particular, I think, the problem that most pastors have is that they come into the church, they come into this position with certain views of who they are before God that are not healthy. And that's true of all of us, of course. Just, none of us have these things kind of perfected. But the temptation becomes that if things are going well in ministry, that is a reflection of who I am as a person. This is where you get the old adage that if you want to know how a pastor talks to themselves, listen to their preaching. It's an interesting adage because it's one of those things that I think is probably right, that the pastor is first and foremost preaching to themselves. And so when you think of the pastor that's kind of yelling at their people, you have to be particularly kind to that person.
Wow.
Because they're screaming into the abyss of their soul. Wow. And it's a very dim reality. But I think one of the biggest problems we have when we get, particularly churches today, where churches and pastors are not separated out, but they're the same thing, right? So the pastor, when you say so-and-so's church, right? Like, oh, well, that's so-and-so's church, as if the pastor somehow owns it or if it's identified by them. You see churches take on the personality of their pastors because the pastor is now seen as the church in a real sense, and therefore their standing and in their identity in a lot of ways is predicated on the church. And so that same pastor that's yelling at people is often yelling at them because they're not the mirror he wants them to be. What he's looking for is a mirror that mirrors back to him greatness, that mirrors back success, that mirrors back goodness, right? And so for some, if I'd say for very few, but you think of the classic kind of the megachurch pastors are often able to look out and it's a good mirror to them.
Yeah. Lots of people listening, giving them good feedback.
Totally. And what's interesting about that, once you get to a certain size, it doesn't even matter who those people are. because you don't know them anyway. So it's, as long as there's people there, so statistically, what happens in megachurches all the time is people are leaving constantly, but there's enough new people there. And because they're kind of faceless crowds, it doesn't matter. As long as the crowd is there, the mirror's there that I'm looking for.
Mm-hmm.
But then you have the same problem in smaller churches. You have the same problem. This is where it's a problem everywhere. And so you have some churches where people are, you have 20 people there, and it's a bad mirror to them. And so they're trying to think of a way to generate a better mirror, or they just are in despair because they think that somehow this does reflect something true of them. And this kind of union between how the church is doing, quote unquote, and who the pastor is as a person, that is a ugly kind of union. But it's something that everyone does to some degree, right? We all look at our work or our relationships, or we're all looking for mirrors of various kinds.
Yeah.
We just naturally do that. And the danger with ministry is that if it goes well, if it is a good mirror, that's actually the worst mirror to have in ministry. If you have a good mirror that allows you to kind of value yourself because of the things going on out there, that is just a open door for narcissism to kind of run amok.
Well, it makes me wonder too, kind of flipping it on the other side of things, if you were to be a pastor that, pursued kind of costly humility and power and weakness, what kind of redeemed mirror that might create, like how you might see that reflected in your people, and that the people not only are following the lead of the pastor, but the pastor's also opening himself up and being vulnerable to the people. How transformative that might be in a church.
Totally. Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. I mean, I think that's and even just what that'll do even in preaching. One of the old kind of Puritan assumptions about preaching was that if you can navigate your soul, you can navigate everyone else's. And so deep preaching comes out of deep humility, precisely because you have seen the depth of your brokenness in the presence of God and others. And therefore you can speak deeply about the human heart. And unfortunately, that's not something a kind of narcissist is really probably going to give themselves to, because seeing their brokenness isn't a good, because they're still trying ultimately to find the goodness within them, to find some sort of kind of perfection there.
It's almost as though we treat, as leaders in the church, we treat that brokenness as a liability that we need to sort of cover and hide at all costs, because then people, they have no savior figure to look to, which, obviously the irony is that would be good if you're not their savior.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, totally.
Now, there are certainly a lot of churches that have very charismatic leaders with very strong personalities. They're especially in evangelical circles. Do you find that this is primarily an evangelical problem, or is this something that's kind of throughout the Christian world continues to be problematic?
Yeah, I think the problem is we're discussing it now, where you kind of have particularly kind of narcissistic leaders, like toxic leadership, that you don't see that everywhere, but you see the problem of power everywhere. It just takes on different forms. And I think there's certain ways to kind of protect against it. I actually think one of the ways is a more kind of plurality in leadership in general. That doesn't mean you don't have a kind of quote unquote main or head pastor. There are some people that want to go that way and say, well, this is a reason why we should kind of get rid of that as a position. I think that's an overreach. Although interestingly enough, I'm at a church, I'm on a preaching team at a church where I preach monthly, and we have a preaching team rather than a kind of head pastor. And it's some kind of elder run church in that regard. I don't think there's any silver bullet model of church, and I don't think there's any quote unquote biblical model of church in terms of a single, like, this is the only way to do it. I think there are more biblical and less biblical models out there, certainly, but I don't think we should be necessarily looking for, like, what's the kind of silver bullet model that'll fix our problems. I think we need to discern, where are we and what are the temptations that are particularly ingrained in the model we have. And so, like, an evangelical church that focuses a service on preaching primarily, there's going to be a certain kind of temptations towards narcissist leaders that, say, an Anglican church probably won't have. Or, I'm trying to think of another example. Like, let's say the kind of charismatic American church will have certain kind of temptations that a charismatic African church, for instance, won't have, but they'll just have different forms of those in a lot of ways. And so, but wherever I go, I see the problem kind of lurking in different modes. Like, there's just different kind of forms of these kinds of things. And, it's, one of the key features of our language in our book comes from James 3, where you get the kind of world, the flesh, and the devil as the kind of threefold archetype of evil in the world. And so when you think of worldliness, Jesus, when he's, attacking the Pharisees as being from their father, the devil, and whereas he is from the Father, there's an interesting juxtaposition there that isn't anything like what we would normally think of as toxic leadership, but has everything to do with, how they are not shepherding the sheep by laying down their life for them, in terms of how they see their role as quote unquote leaders. And I think we need to kind of grasp the broader point so that we can see the different ways it is in flesh, because my worry is what ends up happening is, someone reads a book like ours, and it's easy to think of a dozen examples of this outside of your own context. What makes it a difficult read, I think, is how to discern, how am I tempted towards this personally, and how are we in our church tempted towards this specifically? And it can take on any number of forms. My church, because of the nature of the power structure, will have very different features to it than a church that is very kind of top-down, single pastor, personality driven. They're going to have a very different sort of temptations.
Yeah. Well, and what I love about The Way of the Dragon and The Way of the Lamb is that it's not a hit piece. You're not trying to take these digs at different megachurch pastors who have fallen, because we, as you said, we could all do that. We could all locate any number of people in that sort of sphere. But I wonder, just kind of as we come to a close here, just maybe some practical wisdom for you, from you, for people like Dave and I or our listeners. What does it look like for you in your own life to confront, that temptation toward toxic power? And maybe what advice would you give to whether it's up and coming leaders or it's leaders who find themselves in a position of power and they don't really know where to go or what to do?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think first and foremost, we need to come to grips with Jesus's vision for power, and we need to actually believe it's true. And so I think the first thing we need to do is really wrestle with the ways we don't actually believe it's true. Ways that we don't believe the widow's mite is more money than the money the Pharisees put in. Ways that we look at the world and we just say, Lord, I'm sorry, but the first aren't last and the last aren't first. The world doesn't work that way. Like, we need to actually come to wrestle with ways we just don't buy it. And I think if we're honest, we come to see that there are ways we don't buy it. And we really need to pray, Lord, I believe, but help me here in my unbelief.
Yes.
Because there's all sorts of ways that we struggle with this. But then secondly, I would say, when particularly this happens when we witness kind of wicked power in the church, one of the things that has been true for Jamin and I over the years And, this is someone that I can, so a lot of these pastors that have very famously lost their ministries are people that I was shepherded under. Mm. And so I know this is a very personal question for me in a lot of ways. And, there was a time when if they would have fallen, there's part of me that would have rejoiced a bit. Mm. There's a part of me that at least for some of them, I would have said, I told you people, right? Like I was screaming this stuff from the rooftops and no one would listen, kind of thing. Yeah. But now I've gotten to a place where I can really lament, which I think is the appropriate response. Mm. And the way I got there was by recognizing that when these things happen, I don't turn to point a finger. I turn inward and recognize that could have been me. Mm. That only the Lord has protected me from this. Mm. That it's not my savvy, it's not my goodness. I didn't, strategize well. Like I've had dear friends fall from ministry, and for whatever reason, the Lord just didn't thwart their path like He thwarted mine. Mm. And so it's coming to grips with our own temptations, our own desires. And now for folks like me, I had a kind of desire for grandiosity. That's not true of a lot of people. So they're going to have to come up with ways. They have to come to recognize ways that, and I imagine for Jamin and I, who are very similar, we probably speak to people who are a little more inclined towards grandiosity. And so they're going to have to be a little more creative to think through, particularly as they wrestle with the kind of modeling of Jesus as Jesus modeled the way of power. Like what are the ways that I just kind of don't buy this? Like, what are the ways that I really struggle with this? What are the ways that I do this that maybe doesn't match kind of power? But then I think, we have to begin to see, not only as I look at my own life, how have I given myself to this, but I think something that rarely happens is how do I judge what is actually powerful? And I think we just need to attend to that. If anything else, wherever you land on politics, I think you have to say evangelicals just haven't thought about what kingdom power is. Like, we just haven't even thought about it. Yeah. The questions never come up that our view of power is as worldly as the devil's view of power. Yeah. And that shows up in politics very clearly, but that means it shows up elsewhere. How do we judge? I remember, for instance, give an example of judging like a sermon. I remember years and years ago, and it was a youth pastor. There was a youth pastor that was doing this kind of rally, and I showed up at the very end. I was actually in college at the time, but I had some friends still in high school that were there. I was a freshman, and I went back, and the first 4 people I ran into, all of them said the same thing. That was amazing. And I said, really? What did he say? And not a single one of them could tell me a word he had said. And I remember that by the time I got to the 4th person, I began pressing. I said, don't you think it's a problem that you leave raving about how amazing? Because really what you're saying is he's amazing. Yeah. And you have no idea you're not leaving with anything. Like, you feel good, like you're energized. But when you think about, like, how do we judge things? We judge everything, right? I mean, hitting like on things is ubiquitous now. Like, what causes you to like things, right? What causes you to like sermons and worship songs? And what causes you to like books? What causes you to, like, are we judging things that are giving us, are kind of presupposing a view of power that is actually antithetical to the cross? Mm-hmm. And because, what's interesting to me is how often you see, going back to the toxic leader problem, with all these toxic leaders, what's been so interesting is, by and large, no one's been really surprised that doesn't go to the person's church. So it's not like these people aren't known to be toxic leaders in broad Christianity. Mm-hmm. And yet their congregants are astonished. and you're kind of like, well, wait a second. Like, what have you been, like, why do we all know this is what's going on? Why did you seem totally oblivious to it? But it goes back to that person or those people who told us, well, they're arrogant, but they can sure preach. Like they don't know how to weigh things and judge them Christianly. And so we need to begin to wrestle with ways that that's true of us, of what are we actually using when we kind of judge things in the kingdom? And that might be our own spiritual lives. I think most of us very subconsciously take our spiritual temperature based on how we're feeling.
Oh man, yeah.
Right? Like we have this weird sense that our feelings have direct access to God. Right?
Yeah, I think that's very common. Just you are, instead of becoming a sense, our emotions become a map to what we should have and what we shouldn't have.
Yeah. And so it's like, if I'm feeling good, we kind of presuppose God likes me. God and I are doing great, and if things are going bad, if things are struggling, and we're like, kind of like, wow, God, why'd you leave me alone out here? Like, why have you abandoned me? Why have you, one of my favorite verses is 1 John 3:19 and 20, because, in that passage, John presupposes that Christians will have their hearts condemn them in God's presence. It says, when you are before him and your hearts condemn you. So you're in God's presence, and John assumes your heart's condemning you. And it's like, what is happening there? Right? That's fascinating. And his response is, God's greater than your heart and he knows everything. And he doesn't say, well, you better get your act together. God's ticked, right? He doesn't assume your heart has access to God. Your heart's doing what your heart does because it's fallen. And so we need to kind of really begin to sit with, why do I think that this church is powerful just because it's exciting? Like, maybe excitement and power aren't synonymous in the kingdom. Or why do I think that person must be holy just because, they can really shred the guitar in a worship song, right? Or that they can get up and preach in front of people. Like there's these assumptions we have that seem to give us these really simplistic accounts of discernment that are just not discerning at all. And so how do we actually kind of attend to what it means to discern real power? And we'll begin to see that love actually is a harder thing to discern. And it's going to take a little longer. It's going to take different metrics, not worldly ones, right?
You mentioned that when you put the book out, you got pretty much acclaim everywhere. Did you guys have anybody coming to you saying, pushing back on you, like feeling like this was pointed at them and being upset at you for saying something like that?
No, I mean, not publicly, no, or not publicly or personally, no. I've actually been astonished. I kind of thought we were going to get absolutely demolished for writing this book. Like, I thought people were going to come out of the woodwork and attack us. That hasn't happened, at least not about this directly. To a way that scares me a little bit, because it means I don't think people truly are sitting with what we're claiming. Because there's plenty of people we know don't buy this, at least at all practically, who've loved the book.
Yeah.
And so that it does raise questions about it reminds me of something Jon Stewart once said. If you remember when the owners of the LA Clippers got recorded with all these racial slurs and all these things, and his response was fascinating. It was Donald Sterling. And Sterling's response was, well, everyone that knows me knows I'm not a racist. And Jon Stewart was reflecting on that, and he said, the problem is, as a society, we've learned racism is bad, and so everyone just assumes they're not a racist because they're not bad.
Yeah, no one wants to admit that they're bad.
That's right. And I think the same things happen with this. It's like, if we make the case biblically, everyone goes, well, I'm biblical, therefore I can't have given in myself into this.
Yeah. It kind of goes to something you were saying earlier, where because everybody enters into whatever they're doing with good motivations, if you then suddenly have somebody calling you out, you're going, you can't say that about me. I have good intentions.
Totally.
How do you say that about me?
Totally. I said, to the glory of God at the end of that sermon. Therefore, right? That's what we've struggled with. The real problem is not the only people that have. I sat with a group of elders who really attacked me in the book, pretty viciously, actually. It was fascinating. I liked them. I mean, we had a general conversation, although they cursed me out a couple times, which was interesting. But for these guys, and it was interesting because as I was listening to them, it became clear to me, wow, like it's so scary that you were elders because you just have never learned how to think biblically. But they were all the kind of elders we usually ask, people that could write a check to get us out of problems, people who've done well in the business world. I mean, the other place, other than hiring, if you want to look at a church's view of power, look at how churches raise up elders and the kinds of people they want. And it was interesting because the pushback these guys had was, this doesn't work. Right? Like I run a business, you can't tell me that weaknesses. And every time I would correct them, because they were always oversimplifying what we said in the book, they would be like, oh yeah, well, yeah, okay, yeah, you might have gotten out of that one. But you could tell that for them, the world just doesn't work this way. Mm-hmm. And I was like, yeah, that's why it's faith and not sight. And that's why we need faith.
Yeah, and we worship a crucified Lord.
That's right.
That's a hard thing to swallow whenever the world worships elevated leaders.
That's right.
So how what does it look like for you guys to, I mean, I guess you've talked about this a little bit, like, have you seen specific instances in your life where you've had to practice what you preach, so to speak, in this area, where you've had to like call yourself back from a situation like, wait, I've stepped into a bad area where I'm veering into danger zone with power? What does it look like for you guys on that?
Yeah, totally. The hard thing about this, so let me give you two kind of examples of this, is the thing I struggle with is, one of the overly simplified solutions is to say, if you're tempted to something, you shouldn't do it. And so I'll get asked to do things. And I remember I got asked to do something that was really prestigious. And I just said yes right away. And afterwards I was like, like I never really stopped and asked, is this the kind of thing I should be giving myself to? I said yes because it was prestigious. And so the next time something prestigious came around, I had to step back and say, okay, why would I say yes to something like this? Well, I want to say yes because I want to be seen in a certain kind of way. I want people to know I'm seen as an authority in these sorts of things. I want kind of accolades that come with this. And I was like, well, then that's not a good enough reason. But just because I'm tempted to those things doesn't mean I shouldn't say yes. And that's what's hard, is that I think sometimes the Lord calls us into the very areas we're tempted in, precisely so we come to recognize our weakness there. And so one of the ways you can do this, so what this is not something I've done, this wasn't my idea, let me put it that way. When we had this conference, so we recently had this conference for the first time that we're going to hopefully start doing around the country on the Way of the Dragon, Way of the Lamb, where we just bring pastors together to wrestle through this. Because for Jamin and I, we really want to start a new conversation about power because one's not being had. And so the first one we did was just recently. It was Jamin and I, his co-pastor Sam kind of ran the event, and then we invited Scott Sauls and Ann Voskamp out because Scott has also written on this in terms of leadership, and Ann has done a bunch of work in this area. And before the conference started, we all got together. We all had dinner at Sam's house, and then Sam was leading this evening, and he said, we're about to start shepherding people into questions about weakness. So what does it mean for us to do this? And so, and I've been to plenty of conferences where things are so hectic, you forget to pray about the conference beforehand, kind of a thing. And we spent over an hour going around and sharing areas where we are tempted and where we're tempted to abandon our weakness, and areas where we really feel weak. And, some of us don't know each other well at all. And we spent well over an hour just slowly going around and attending to, here's my temptation right now. Here's where I am struggling right now. And I think, again, this is what I think most pastors don't have, is a space to do that. See, I think one of the greatest gifts I've ever been given is I've got not only Jamin, but a department and very dear friends where these are the normal conversations for us. I met, for the first 3 years of my job, I met with my boss weekly, and we would have conversations like, you know, you had that student that's like really arrogant in the class. Like, what did that do to you when that person said that? When they kind of undermined what you said? Like, what happened in you? And, you know, I think pastors in particular need that. You know, what happened when you looked over to the left and you saw that person sleeping? What did that do in your soul, right? Why did you look away so quickly?
It's almost the kind of feelings that we often want to put, you know, out of sight, out of mind. I know I'm very blessed to have a wife who is very good at asking those poignant questions of me, and especially when I was in vocational ministry, she would ask those questions often, and I would, I hated it.
Yeah,
you know?
totally.
But in hindsight, it's been so good, because I know at times when I've been a worship leader, you know, you get so caught up in the production of things and making sure everything's put together. You don't pray, you don't ask your team how they're doing. You kind of get into the rigmarole of hurrying up through the process so that you can put on a good show. And man, like that spiritual attention is the very place where the Lord wants to meet us and to equip us to really lead under the power of the Holy Spirit and not under our own power.
Yeah, totally. And that's, you know, creating contexts where our vision is constantly brought to those places, I think is particularly important. And then I would say finally, in terms of that, you know, the area that I've struggled with the most, I think, in terms of being the most difficult to kind of discern for me, is how and when do you name publicly evil power when you see it?
Yeah, that's a really good one, because I mean, there's a lot of people on the internet, especially, who have proclaimed themselves to be discernment ministries of one form or another, and it seems like there is a major danger in that pursuit, where it, in many cases, turns into arrogance and unteachability, and yeah, exactly. It just becomes a very disruptive pursuit.
That's right. Yeah. Well, and it's, you know, the term that Jamin and I came up with in the book was kind of nonviolent. No, it's not nonviolent. It was non-divisive resistance. You know, we use the nonviolent resistance. And so that's the term that's always in the back of my mind, is like, what does non-divisive resistance look like? And that means it probably can't be done on the internet unless it's so far down the chain that divisiveness is no longer a major issue. But there's been times on both sides. There's been times where I think I probably spoke too soon. There's been some times I've been embarrassed that I didn't speak up a little sooner. But it's a hard thing these days to navigate that, particularly when it comes to kind of internet questions and the broader church.
Well, Kyle, I want to say thank you so much for taking the time taking so much time generously to talk with us. This has been such a fruitful conversation for the two of us, and you know, we, in our discussions, it's been a topic that has been heavy on our hearts, both personally and, you know, corporately in the church, and what we've seen and what we've interacted with, and even as we wrestle with it, you know, interpersonally. So we are very thankful for you taking the time to do this, man, and just giving us so much wisdom. And I know our listeners are going to benefit greatly from this.
Oh, well, it's so good being with you guys. Thanks for having me.
Is there a place where, if folks want to find out more about you and your work, that they can go to get more information?
Sure. I mean, I'm just Kyle Strobel at Twitter, so that's always a decent spot. But I think there's also a KyleStrobel.com page somewhere floating around, maybe, or just my faculty page at Talbot would be fine as well.
Well, thank you very much again for taking the time out to be with us, and hopefully we can do this again soon.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thanks, guys. Bless you guys.
Yeah.